Good morning to all of you and welcome to this webinar on talent acquisition for SMEs. Basically, in terms of the agenda that we have today, we'll start off by trying to understand the difference between recruitment and talent acquisition. Also try to understand in detail in terms of what is the life cycle for talent acquisition and what are the key elements that constitute the life cycle. What are the typical challenges that SMEs face in terms of attracting talent? We'll also touch upon some of the new age practices on talent acquisition with a specific focus on social media recruitment. And then also look at some of the metrics on talent acquisition and what companies and SMEs should focus on in terms of some of the talent acquisition metrics. And basically wind up the session in terms of trying to look at what are some of the critical areas that SMEs need to focus in terms of having an effective talent acquisition strategy. So by starting the, let's start the webinar by trying to understand what is the definition of talent acquisition. Firstly, talent acquisition is a strategic approach, and it primarily involves identifying, attracting and putting on board top-notch talent to effectively manage the business and also tackle the dynamic nature of the businesses as they evolve. And if you were to look at what are the key elements there, it involves one, identification, evaluation and selection of people who possess the desired knowledge, skills and attributes for a certain job. Now if you look at, there's always this nagging question in terms of, what is the difference between recruitment and talent acquisition. Now most of us would typically say that, the term talent acquisition is very synonymously used with recruiting, but actually there are fundamentally big differences between the two. Recruitment is actually a subset of the talent acquisition. Now, one way to distinguish between recruitment and talent acquisition on a certain set of parameters, while recruitment is a linear process where typically the employers would source candidates for the existing vacancies which are currently available. Talent acquisition is an ongoing cycle of processes which involves building the employer brand, communicating the value proposition of the employer, and also establishing an ongoing relationship with the targeted talent segments. So recruitment is just one of those components of talent acquisition. Now the other important element also would be in terms of the proactive nature of talent acquisition. Now if you look at talent acquisition, it is not an issue of filling positions today. You're essentially taking a fairly long-term view and also using those candidates that come out of a recruiting campaign as a means to fill very similar positions in the future. And many of these future positions may be identifiable today, either by looking at the succession management plan that the company has, or looking at the history of attrition for certain positions in the organization. And therefore it will make it much more easier to predict that there are certain specific openings that will occur at a predetermined frequency or a predetermined period in time. And in most of these cases of strategic talent acquisition, companies will recruit today for positions that may not even be required today, but are expected to become available or open up in the future. So that is where the fundamental difference between talent acquisition and recruitment comes, where it is a strategic process as opposed to something which is a tactical event where you just fill up the vacancy which is available at this point in time. Now, the other important aspect to look at is from the cost considerations. Now, as we said that recruitment is going to be, reactive in nature, and therefore you will have increased, time to hire and cost to hire. And many times we have seen that, organizations will also compromise on quality to manage cost and time. And most of the money that is spent on strategic talent acquisition would have also been spent in a tactical recruiting mandate in any case. Now, the only additional cost in talent acquisition is in collecting data on high potential candidates and keeping in touch with them until the hiring is made by the company. And if you look at it in a macro picture, the additional cost becomes pretty insignificant compared to the value of hiring top-notch talent over a period of time. Now, just coming back to the strategic process. Now, when you talk of a strategic process, the basic intent of this process and conversation with the potential candidate is more of a relationship building exercise, wherein the candidate has the opportunity to express, future career aspirations, and the employer or the recruiter has enough and more information to determine if there is a potential fit with the company. And if during this whole strategic recruiting call, the candidate has declares that they're both qualified and interested, then the tactical nature of the entire recruitment process will also be fulfilled. Now, if on the other hand, if the candidate lacks the experience or the timing for the career move is not an appropriate at this point in time, then they become candidates for the future if and when many of those roles open up or arise. So in a recruitment sort of scenario, the typical nature of it is the employer or the recruiter is asking the candidate, are you qualified and interested? So it just becomes an event in the entire process. So this is the fundamental difference between recruitment and the talent acquisition. And clearly the business case for acquiring talent strategically is far more compelling than just filling positions which fall vacant today. And if companies or SMEs or if any of those companies are looking at being the employer of choice, I think all such companies would definitely need to have a talent acquisition strategy, which will help you to consistently attract, capture, and communicate with the best candidates in the industry or in your own industry for that matter. Next, we come to the talent acquisition cycle. Now, basically, if you look at if we talk about SMEs for the moment, now recruiting and staffing any small business is not very simple, and it is more than just and this applies to even a larger company, but in the case of smaller companies, it becomes even bigger challenge, as we will talk about it in the later part of the presentation. And hiring of employees is not merely just posting an advertisement and accepting applications and running a background check. Now, the entire recruitment and the selection process, right from the start to finish, has various stages, as is there in the slide that I put in front of you. And this, along with the strategic components that we talked about, such as employer branding, talent relationship management, the various metrics that one would use, is together what one refers to as the talent acquisition cycle. Now, this cycle ensures that companies are able to attract the best possible talent and Also to ensure that the employment relationship deal is sealed with the employees at whom you recruit, with an onboarding process that welcomes the new addition to staff. So that is the entire process of the talent acquisition life cycle. Now, the talent acquisition planning and strategy there will ensure that there is business alignment. You also relook at your workforce plans. You also look at the availability of workforce from the market, and also look at how the global scenario is going to impact your operations. And also it means that before you start determining the various specifications for the vacant positions, you need to have a very clear idea of what is the workforce segmentation, wherein you will need to know what are the different workforce segments, what are the positions within these segments, the skills, competencies, and the experiences that are required. And secondly, also to know what the candidate audience is, wherein you need to understand, defining and understanding the audience in which you need to source the required skill set. And you should have different sourcing strategies. You cannot have a one fits all sort of strategy to source your manpower, and that is based on what the job entails and where the audience for that particular job would be sourced from. Now, within each of these core elements are various sub-activities and best practices, and we are going to be discussing each of these components during the course of the presentation. Now, coming to SME, so what is so unique about SMEs that you need to look at? One, obviously, as I think all of you are quite well aware, the cornerstones of an SME are, one is the entrepreneurship and the other is the private ownership. And they also have a very important characteristic, is the flexibility. Given that the nature of operations, the scale of operations of its business being relatively small sized and not a very complicated organization structure, one of the important characteristics is the flexibility, which enables such companies to adjust to changes in the market demand. For instance, currently, if you look at the auto sector, which is going through a downturn. Now, obviously, one of the sectors that will be very critically impacted would be the SME sector. So they will have to readjust their production volumes, maybe cut down on manpower and readjust the way they do business. So given the characteristic of the SME, they're able to have this flexibility to downsize should the need arise. And competition, as we all know, is all pervading, so it impacts the SMEs in equal measure. And therefore, what distinguishes one SME from the other SME today, in today's context, is one, the sort of employees that they have on board. And very clearly, I think there are various of these research studies and reports, which I'm sure some of you would have read, which clearly shows that in today's context, it's the employees which offer the competitive advantage for the SMEs, not the sort of raw materials, not the sort of markets or the sort of relationships that you have with suppliers and customers, which determine the competitive nature of the SMEs. And if you're going to have a very highly qualified workforce, that is definitely going to increase the competitive advantage of the SMEs in terms of one, ability to meet with any of the technological changes or innovations that one can see in the marketplace, and also adjust to what the market demands in terms of, let's say, if there is a change in product specification. If you have a trained sort of manpower, then you're able to adjust to these changes quickly, and ultimately leading to the quality of products and services. Now, if you look at the business cycle of SMEs, and I think this is important in the context of the sort of people that one would typically hire as far as the SMEs are concerned. So basically, you can categorize the phases of the SMEs into four different phases. the startup phase, the takeoff phase, the harvest phase, and the renewal or the decline phase. Now, typically, the startup phase is the first few years of existence where you try and gain some sort of business, maybe make contact with a few clients and have them, on board. Have few members, who added as staff. You also slowly start building your supply of tools and slowly start making a name for yourself in the marketplace. And this is a period where there are hardly any cash flows or profits, and this requires long hours of work. Now the takeoff stage is the next phase, wherein there is a takeoff phase provided you survive the startup phase, and it is typically the next 2 to 3 years as the business grows. And here essentially the entrepreneur is building on the existing client base who typically are quite satisfied with the product and quality of what you make. So this is a phase where the SME starts, adding on more of staff. You have a bigger office setup or factory setup, and you also have added on more of machinery and plant and equipment to your setup, and you're doing more volumes of work at that point in time. And if you look at the next phase is the harvest phase, where essentially the SME is reaping the benefits of all the work done in the earlier two phases. And this is a phase where you start generating profits, and you're also finding that some of your employees who have been with you slowly start leaving you and start setting up a business which is in competition with you. And this is also a phase wherein you will have to start incurring further capital expenditure to update your plant and machinery. The last phase is the renewal or the decline phase, and it is possible that if you have not kept up pace with the competitive forces in the marketplace, then you have more and more people trying to eat into your business, and thereby you are getting to a decline phase. So if you have reinvented or rejigged the way you do business, perhaps you may not enter the decline phase. So this is a phase where you might either pass it on to somebody else, or decide that enough is enough and you shut down the business. So if you look at the last row there in the slide from a human resources point of view, initially in the startup phase, essentially it is you and a few people there. But as you start growing, you need to start adding on people and delegating work to them. Now the third phase, when there is a harvest phase, there is typically a leadership sort of a crisis in terms of who's going to take on the company to the next level, and there's a sort of complacency which also sorts of sets up in the organization. The last phase is again an issue of succession. So the importance of talent acquisition in SMEs becomes very and as we said that the competitive advantage of the SMEs is the quality of its employees in terms of the relationship with their clients, the way they tackle situation, the speed of their reaction to any thing that needs to be got back to, the motivation and the learning part of it. So if you look at the four phases, besides the first phase that we talked about, all the other phases are highly people oriented, and I think the takeoff stage is a very critical phase wherein you need to hire the best of people to run your business and grow the business. And the harvest phase is where the retention is becoming a very important issue for the SMEs, because if all the key people leave, then it becomes very difficult to manage the company in a time where you're expecting to generate profits. And you also need to invest in leadership quality. And the last phase, as I mentioned, is again a phase where there's a huge team that you have at that point in time. So you will have a lot of statutory compliances that you have to make. You have the interpersonal dynamics also comes into play. So to sum up this slide, basically the intellectual capital, the knowledge, competence of employees will determine whether the SME is going to succeed or fail in a dynamic sort of environment. And it is very clear that the human resources management has become a very key element in the strategy of every SME in their efforts to establish and maintain their competitive edge in the marketplace. Now, having said that, and I think it goes without saying that acquisition of talent for SMEs is a big challenge. And I think there are a number of reasons for it. And I think the first key reason is that there is a widespread notion that SMEs are not good paymasters. So it becomes all the more difficult for the promoters of the SMEs to attract talent, and that becomes a stumbling block for them to get good talent in the first place. The second important challenge is there is no brand identity for an SME, and I think it builds up over a period of time. So to start off with, you're not going to be able to have a brand to attract talent. So many of your prospective audiences may not even know, that such a company would exist. So that becomes an important issue. And the third important point is in terms of the stability factor, where employees do not think of a long-term career is possible in a SME. I think, and therefore the business viability of the SME, etc., is something that comes to the mind of prospective employees. How will an SME survive a downturn, and therefore will a company exist? And that becomes a bottleneck for employees to look at an SME as a career option. And therefore SMEs will have to compete with established companies and MNCs to attract quality talent. And obviously the big challenge for the SME would be to see MNCs which offer fairly large salaries to prospective employees, and also spend a lot of money in terms of their entire recruitment strategies and philosophies. Whereas SMEs are not they're not very well marketed amongst the candidates as prospective employees. So these are various challenges that have to be met by SMEs, and we will try and see, maybe when we sum it up, we will try and see what are the various options available to SMEs to overcome these challenges. So if you look at the basic hygiene factors which are required for the recruitment, they're basically the job descriptions, the ability to conduct interviews, a robust verification process, and a quick and seamless rollout and the onboarding factors. Now we'll go through each of them in a fair bit of detail, but quickly to run you through what it is. When you look at job description, we're referring to the profile specifications of a candidate, which are prepared by companies well in advance based on what the job entails. When you look at the ability of the line managers to conduct interviews, these are essentially the interview assessment guides, and in terms of what the do's and don'ts are and what to look for in a candidate, and also to ensure that the entire process is a fair and transparent process without any attendant biases to it. The third is the verification process, because it becomes a very important part in today's context. And I'm sure when we run through some of those examples or caselets, you'll understand the importance of it. And the last is in terms of the rollout of the offer and getting the employees on board. If you look at the job description, now job description is essentially written on the basis of findings of a step prior to this, which is essentially the job analysis, which aims at examining the various tasks and sequences of tasks to perform the job. So that is how the job description is drafted, and it is typically a broad, general and written statement of a specific job based on the findings of the job analysis. And these are typically narrative, but sometimes you also include a list of competencies which are required as part of the job description. And formal job descriptions are used to evaluate the performance of managers or the employees, and this is to figure out whether the employee has met or exceeded the expectations of that particular job role. Now, some job descriptions may also include references to outcomes or results that they should generate. For instance, if you're in a sales function, you're expected to generate so many crores or so many lakhs of rupees. Or if you're in a consulting sort of a job, you might end up having to have a benchmark of the number of hours that you will charge a client, for instance. And especially the JDs are very important for organizations that do not have a company website or any publicly available information. For example, many of the SMEs there would figure under this. Now, such companies can include a section on the company information in order to sort of create that candidate appeal. It can have information on the company philosophy or the company's mission, vision statements, the typical the culture that is pervading in the organization. What are the various benefits to the employees or perquisites to the employees that are offered? And many times you find that some companies also include the growth path of that particular role in the company. Now, for companies which do not have a job description yet, I think there are a number of consultants who are available who can write out the job description for you. And essentially, writing this entire job description is not a great rocket science or anything. It basically requires some amount of patience and time. And typically, in many companies, what happens is the holder of that particular job role lists down all the key functions and the tasks which are associated with it, which typically is approved by his superior. So if you look at it, this is typically the details of what will be there essentially in a job description. You typically have a job title where you will give a brief description, maybe 1 to 3 words of the job, which essentially will reflect the content, purpose, and scope, and is consistent with the job titles of similar jobs. Then comes to the position summary, which essentially defines the purpose of the job and summarizes the duties and responsibilities of the job. Then comes the job duties and the key responsibility areas, where essentially the organization is, or the duties and the key areas are conveying the job expectations, the role and scope by detailing out the essential tasks, duties and responsibilities of the job. Now, when you talk of responsibilities, they are both supervisory as also the fiscal. When you look at supervisory, you will look at what is the supervision exercised by that particular position, how many people are you supervising at that level, and what is the sort of higher fire authority of that particular position or who occupies that position. And to whom does this particular position report to is the other thing that will be put out. When you look at the fiscal responsibility, essentially these are the sort of budgetary or the financial responsibilities, saying that you can sanction or you can approve bills up to a certain amount, or you can take decisions up to a particular amount. So those are the fiscal sort of responsibilities. The other important thing is the internal and external points of contact. When you talk about internal, it basically talks about who are the people that you have to generally be in touch with in the organization, and it could be heads of other departments in the organization. Now, external points of contact could be clients, customers, or vendors. In many cases, or many organizations, which are, if you look at a number of KPIs, for instance, the external contact typically is only the client, or at times, the vendors. So you cannot be, having contacts with various other people whom you're not supposed to. Then comes the physical demands in terms of, if this is something, if there's a field work for a sales person, then you will detail out, the frequency of travel. It could be, the international travel or the domestic travel, or it could also detail out, for instance, the night shifts in a call center. So those need to be explicitly maintained. And last is the qualification and the experience required. Basically, what sort of educational qualifications, what is the experience, or if there's a certification or a license required. Let's say that, for instance, the company is going to recruit drivers, and these are the sort of things that you will need. And there could be other skills required. For instance, if you're looking at someone who's computer literate, then you should have the following skills and so on and so forth. So this is basically the detailed set of elements that will constitute a job description. Now, if you look at interviews, and as we said in the earlier slide, that the hiring managers would need to be very careful about, what they do in an interview process, and to ensure that they select the right sort of candidates. So we'll run through what each of these are, and I'm sure that many of us have gone through this whole process, and at times might have also, had one of these biases at some point in time. The idea is to ensure that these biases are not, the biases do not creep during the interview process. So if you look at the various biases that can creep during an interview, first is the halo effect. It's basically forming a first impression based on, the responses to one or two questions, and then deciding whether the candidate is good or bad. So this is something that one needs to avoid. The other is called as the leniency or the stringency effect. Is to give all candidates, a very high or low score or rating on that particular interview. And the third is the central tendency effect, essentially to rate all the candidates in the middle of the rating scale that you might have. Inconsistency in questioning is you ask different questions to candidates on the same job. So when there's a particular job, you're looking at a particular set of skill sets. So all your questioning the basket of questions should contain essentially those questions which will test out what the skills that are required for that particular job. It shouldn't be at a tangent to what you need. Warm body syndrome is to hire someone as soon as, or anyone as soon as possible. Oversell is essentially to enhance the realities of the job and the company to get a well-qualified candidate. Friendship factor is, many cases you will find that employees have referred their friends, for a particular position there. So this is essentially a friendship factor. Essentially means that there's a greater tendency to rely heavily on the personal references of the friends. Memory fade, and this sometimes you will interview a number of people, but then you will only recollect what happened to the interview process, the first candidate, and have a memory lapse for the rest of them, in which case you may not be doing the right sort of thing. And contrast effect, essentially it would mean that strong candidates who are interviewed after weak candidates may appear more qualified than they are actually deserve to be because of this contrast. Because the first candidate did not meet your expectations, so somebody else who would be incrementally better would appear extremely strong. The next is the first impression error, and wherein the interviewer is going to be taking snap judgments and lets his impression cloud the entire interview. Now, for instance, let's say that I'm interviewing a candidate and that particular candidate is from my college. So, I'll be very happy, okay, now XYZ is from my college, so he must be good. Now, in doing so, you're not testing the applicant's knowledge, nor the skills, nor the abilities of that particular candidate. So this is the first impression error can be quite dangerous. The other is non-verbal bias, wherein it has nothing to do with the job performance, but certain non-verbal cues which the interviewee might, exhibit during the interview process, or something that you might, factor in, which need not be. For instance, it could be things like distracting mannerisms. For instance, is something that can sort of irritate the interviewer and might, negate the entire employment. Talking too much. Essentially, there's something called as the 80-20 rule. Now, according to this rule, the interviewer should talk only 20% of the time, and the interviewee should be talking for a majority of the time, roughly about 80% of the time that he spent in the interview room. But many times, there is a tendency of interviewers to, hog the limelight and talk much beyond, what is required. See, the whole idea of that process is to elicit as much of information and knowledge about the candidate. So if you're going to be talking more and more, then the whole process becomes quite redundant. Rescuing is a process where typically there could be a silence from the candidate after a particular question has been asked, and then the interviewer is trying to rescue the candidate by trying to fill up the gap and answer that question. And for all you know, the candidate might be trying to gather his thoughts during that short period of silence. So the guide there is to be patient and do not talk, but give time for the person to answer your questions. There could also be personal bias, for instance, which could be anything like cultural stereotypes or lifestyles or personalities, appearances, etc. And there could be an attractive person bias. So if someone is seen as attractive, you might end up selecting that. There could be interviewers who would end up selecting them, whereas on the job knowledge and the sort of skill set that is required for the job, that candidate might really fall short. Personal similarity bias, again, if a candidate has exhibited very similar sort of traits or interests which are very similar to the interviewer, there is a chance that the interviewer might exhibit a bias. The last part is the cultural noise, and the failure to recognize the responses of a candidate that are socially acceptable rather than factual. Now, this typically will happen because the candidate wants a job, so he will be very reluctant to tell the interviewer which are the facts which are unacceptable about himself or herself. So essentially here the candidate is going to give very politically correct responses. Now, for instance, many times you will find that candidates are applying for jobs where their authority and responsibilities are a lot lower than what he or she has in the current job. And when the interviewer is asking that question in terms of how they're feeling about it, the normal response is because the candidate is desperate or maybe he doesn't have a job, he's quite open to accepting that particular position, although he may really not want to state that fact. So these are some of the biases which creep into this whole process. So the idea of putting in all of these is to ensure that these biases do not creep in the entire interview process. Now, if you look at the other processes, one is the background verification, the other is the offer rollout, and the third is the onboarding. Now, if you look at the background verification, now this entire process, which I'm sure is being done by all of your companies that you're representing, is basically to ensure that the organization is not faced with risk of frauds or thefts or industrial espionage in terms of leaking information about the company, disruption of operations, or the reputational damage, and it basically promotes safe and a secure sort of work environment. Now, the problem is if you're going to hire somebody without doing a background check, there is a possibility that the reputation of the organization is very much at stake. Also, the brand equity and the value can be very adversely impacted if it is known that the organization has not done the due diligence before recruiting, a particular individual. I think there are a number of cases that we have seen where, in many of these BPOs and KPOs, where even when they hire the travel agency, and many times it has been found that background checks have not been done, and all these come to notice only after a particular event has happened. And therefore, the other important thing is the concept of background checking. It's a misnomer that it's only done for the IT or the BPOs or the KPOs. And I think across the board, the background screening practice is something which has been adopted, and it is typically outsourced to a background verification company. And Indian companies continue to proactively adopt this as part of the business process. Now, basically, there are various checks that which are done. For instance, it could be an education, employment, the address verification, the identity check, PAN card, and so on. I think the list goes on, so I don't want to get into each of those. And basically, you also try and see what is the discrepancy rate between what is presented by the candidate and what is it that has been found. So if the discrepancy rate is very high, it means that obviously the candidate is someone that you don't want on your records. Just wanted to give you one example of one of these examples of what a bad background check verification can do to a company. Now, basically, what happened was there's a financial crime group based in London who basically planted an employee in the outsourcing unit of a bank in India and in the call center process. So what this employee did was to provide critical information of various customers by accessing the database to this particular group, which is based out of London. And this group essentially siphoned off almost about $5 lakh in a span of just 2 months. What later on was found out was that the employee had submitted false employment records, which was not verified or detected by the current employer at the time of hiring. So just one example, and I'm sure there are enough and more examples that are available for us to see. So I think it is a very important part in the entire process of recruitment. Now, having done all that, and if one is satisfied, then you get into the offer rollout, where the details of compensation, the appointment letter, and the rest of the works are given, including the list of documents that have to be produced. And then comes the final stage of onboarding, which essentially means that you're bringing a new employee into the organization, where essentially all the operational activities are done in terms of creating an ID, the business cards, the various documentation. And then you go into the induction process, where essentially you're trying to provide the employee with what the organization's corporate philosophies and goals are, what their missions are, the culture, what are the do's and don'ts, and the systems and processes. And lastly, also in terms of what the job role entails and what are the key areas that he or she needs to focus on from a responsibility point of view, and what are the key result areas that one is looking at. So if you look at some of the traditional recruitment practices, we'll quickly run through it before we move on to some of the newer practices. Typically print ads, we still see a lot of them. Job portal ads, there could be cold calling through resumes that you have sourced from any of the job portals. Walk-in drives, where you then sometimes through the employment exchanges, outsourced manpower support for many of the activities that you do, campus recruitments, placement agencies, consultants, and recruitment for unskilled workers at the factory gates. Well, let's look at what are some of the new age practices, and we will be going through each of these in detail. Basically, we're going to be touching upon four key practices. One is the employer branding, the sourcing and screening of the CVs, talent relationship management, and interviews and onboarding. We'll be talking about the employer branding from the professional networking perspective, the social media, and the candidate audience, and we will move on to each of those as we get on. So if you look at the employer branding through social media, and that is something that has become a very important way of branding the company and also creating the awareness of the company to a wider audience. It is either through LinkedIn, which essentially is the social networking medium for professionals. Essentially, companies do maintain a web page, a company page there, and provide updates in terms of what the company is doing, and also provide details in terms of the openings as far as job positions are concerned. The other could also be in terms of the company website, where essentially we are looking at information, the organization's culture, people, career options which are available, and also opinions shared by employees on the corporate blog. And the last is the Facebook and Twitter, where it provides a wider reach to prospective candidates as also the customers. And there could also be other forms of visibility. I think one of the important visibility forms is the employees. They are the biggest brand ambassadors. So I think as a company, you need to communicate with them through town halls or other meetings with them in terms of what the company's growth prospects are, what are the best practices being followed, and what the future requirements are. Now, having done this, only then will the employees feel that they are an integral part of the company and will be the brand ambassadors for the company. The other important thing which number of companies are doing are visiting the school campuses to attract students by offering them short-term project work. Where it may seem a little too early, it has found a lot of success because these are basically a self-motivated group of people, the student community, and therefore attracting them at a very early stage in their career will help them retain them for a long term for the company. And the other important way to do this is also to create partnerships with training institutes that focuses on specialized skills, and maybe offer short-term project work to students in these institutes. And it is important for companies and its key employees to be extremely visible and participating in a number of these industry forums by offering guest lectures, attending trade fairs, exhibitions, industry-specific events. And it's important to leave your contacts behind so that people can come back to you. So if you look at the social media visibility, I'll just run you through some of these examples of how some companies have demonstrated this. Now this essentially is the Facebook page of PepsiCo India. Now maybe you can just pause to see what is there for a minute. So basically, what does it have? It has details on the various brands of the company, the videos of the senior leadership, what is the company's philosophy, what is the presence in the media, the corporate social responsibility initiatives, and also has a link there where you can discuss and also interact with the people there. So this is PepsiCo. If you look at the Twitter account for Infosys, there's a real-time update on jobs, events, and news and career advice. So in terms of here, if you look at this, the last two, for instance, you know, if you are looking at somebody to hire in Pune and some 5 other locations with 8 or even more years of experience in Java, so this is what you have to do. So this is the LinkedIn page of the Times Group. It essentially talks about the company initiatives, the update, various details on the products. This is the corporate blog on Wipro. Where essentially, one, there are contributions by both employees and specialists in each of the verticals. For instance, here there's someone who's talking about, the factors for a successful test environment management. There's also a forum too for employees to be interacting with one another. So this is on Wipro. This is the career pages and recruitment blog in of Oracle. So basically, they're talking about I'm sure many of you would have seen such things in either your own companies or in other companies also, in terms of how a particular employee's career has been. Now, what it's trying to signal here is for someone who's reading it, for them to be familiar in terms of what is the philosophy of that Oracle, for instance. What sort of career path did you get into? And what are the sort of experiences that one needs? So these are things that will be put out in each of these blogs. So it sort of gives a sense prior to this whole process for the candidate that this is the culture in Oracle, for instance. This is a sort of career path that one can expect to get there. So he's prepared in case he doesn't fit into the culture. Maybe he would not even look at applying to Oracle, for instance. This is the candidate audience visibility for Wipro, which basically promotes social learning. There's also this blogging about technology trends, for instance, cloud computing, for instance, something which is in the news for some time now. So you try and understand what is happening as far as technological trends is concerned. And industry news, basically to target candidates who are looking at IT careers. So this is something which is available there. This is basically ITC, where this is called as basically targeted at management trainees and interns, where it's a forum for interns to interact with senior leaders from different business verticals. So interaction is basically regarding the processes, systems, practices, brands, etc. And what the students get to do is to showcase their skills in marketing or HR or supply chain by participating in these case studies. And the two best case studies will get, presented at to the ITC team at their campus. So it's a big thing for the management graduates or any of them to be working on these live cases, and ultimately it might also lead to a pre-placement offer from the company. So this is something which and also saves the company a lot of time in this whole recruitment process. Rather than going at a final placement level, if they engage in such activities, they're able to source the appropriate manpower pretty early. So that is essentially the various ways of looking at the social media from a talent acquisition point of view. Now, if you look at the sourcing, basically it is there are two parts. One is the employee referrals, and the other is talent scouting. And I think employee referral is basically to identify potential candidates from the existing social networks of the employees. And one of the big advantages of this is that it's one of the most cost-effective and efficient recruiting method. And it is a known fact that many of the employers are trying to increase the volume of recruits through this method. And benefits are to the referring employees pretty good. I think both in terms of the sort of bonuses that they are paid and the sort of rewards that they get. This is something which the referring employees would benefit. And while there are a lot of positives in terms of the reduction in the recruitment expenditure, there could be drawbacks also. I think one of the drawbacks is the employer is referring fully and truly in terms of the references made by the employee himself or herself, and you might end up in having a less diverse sort of employee base. So that is one of the pitfalls of employee referral, because you will have very identical profile of people across the department or division, and obviously that is something that companies may not want to have. So I think the biggest advantage is the recruitment cost. So you save a lot of money in terms of going through a headhunter and stuff like that. So you could have either cash bonuses or you could have an internal promotion and things like that. So in terms of how to make this work, make sure that these programs are very simple and easy to use. Otherwise, people will not participate. You have to actively promote the program and make it simple for employees to make the spread the word about this particular job opening, and also decide on what incentives you want to make from time to time. So those are important things that you need to do, and it can be a variety of things that you can look at. Maybe you will change the bonus amounts from time to time, and suppose it's a very difficult position that you want to look at and you are able to get it through employee referral, obviously you might end up paying a little more. For instance, if you look at Agilent, for instance, as a company, what they do is, in order to reduce the tax liability of the employees, they offer what is called as a grossed up bonus, where they will be taken even the tax element into this whole part of it. So there are a number of such rewards that can be offered. It can even be a thank you note, as somebody from Amazon would do. And also, many times you will also reward employees in case a particular hire is not, finally recruited, because this as a motivational tool, you might, offer a slightly lower bonus. Next comes the talent scouting, and typically, I think the first way is to look at, the headhunting, where typically these are third-party recruiters who will try and source the candidate if all the normal methods have failed. And these are typically people or companies who are more aggressive than the in-house recruiters, or they might even be having pre-existing experience. And they typically make high margins on the entire headhunting process, sometimes more than 30% of the candidate's annual compensation. The normal thumb rule is about 30% of the CTC is what they would work, and they typically will work through cultivating these relationships with various companies, have a large database, maintain a network, and sometimes also cold call prospective candidates. Now, there's also the concept of, I think you might have heard of different concepts in this entire process. One could be the headhunting, which is a typical process wherein you will try and identify a candidate and try and persuade them to join the organization. The other is something called as the employee rating, for instance. What you do is, in case you need to have companies to get out the trade secrets of another company, you typically have what is called as an employee rating, where you will recruit that particular person from the competing organization. Now, one of the examples that I would like to give you is there is between Procter and Gamble and Unilever. I think I don't want to name the product nor the persons, etc. But there was a recruitment made by Hindustan Lever in terms of looking at a product manager or marketing manager for one of their products, and it hired that particular person from Procter and Gamble. Now, what had happened was, I think it was strategically planned by Procter and Gamble that this person would be released to Unilever's with the aim to essentially kill that particular product. So it did happen that the sales of Unilever's that particular product had come down dramatically. It was later on found that this particular employee was one of the causes for that. So at the end of it, they had decided on no poaching or no raiding sort of agreement between both these companies. Now, the other important thing is poaching, for instance. Poaching is essentially trying to get all the competent people from another competing organization, and by offering attractive pay packages and better working conditions. And for instance, brunt of the poaching today is largely from the software and the retail sector, notwithstanding the fact that many companies have entered into anti-poaching agreements. For instance, we look at Hindustan Times and Times of India. They have an anti-poaching agreement, and that's the case with many of the companies there. So these are some of the things that one needs to also be a little wary about when you recruit and scout talent, and that is something that companies will need to keep in mind. Next, we move on to screening, and one of the important developments is it has been there for some time now, is the use of artificial intelligence for job description and the CV matching. And using of artificial intelligence is something which has been done for some time now. There are several applications which do it. It could be based either on pattern recognition, that you start putting a few of these search words, and then there's a particular pattern which emerges. For instance, if you're looking at a sales manager, you will keep typing the word sales manager or business development manager or marketing manager. That will throw up a number of such very similar sort of resumes. Or it could be something which is called as the semantic clustering. So you will, maybe if you are looking at recruiting, one of these software sort of people, then you would put in certain words into that algorithm, which could be, either a programmer or a software engineer or developer. So that is something that is a semantic search. Or you could have a fuzzy logic, or basically it's a program to find out a particular set of resumes that you are very keen to take. So that is something that again is done. So artificial intelligence in terms of sourcing the initial set of resumes is something that becomes very important. And obviously the advantages are it is reducing the time to find the relevant sort of matches, and also whenever there is high volume of recruitment needed, this becomes a more effective sort of tool. And also when there is low variation of the keywords, then it becomes very important. So that these are the obvious benefits there. Obviously the disadvantages are, if let's say the recruiter has not understood the actual requirement of the job, then you might end up putting the wrong sort of keywords or the semantic searches to actually get resumes which do not fit in the match. And so these are some of the disadvantages there. Now, if you look at the realistic job previews, now basically what does this mean? This means that before further interviewing, candidates are given some idea in terms of what a day-to-day job will entail. So that's what's called as a preview. So it's a realistic job preview. Now, essentially, it can mean things like case studies or shadowing. Shadowing means, let's say that I'm a salesman. So you tag along with that particular salesman to understand what he does on a day-to-day basis, who are the sort of people he meets, what does he talk, what does he get back, how many times has he been asked to leave the premises, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea of this is to see if you actually fit in with the company's philosophy. Many times one would have seen that a person recruited for sales may typically not be able to do the sales job. He might have got through the interview, but then on-the-job performance might be very different because he might be a very introverted person who may not want to talk to prospective clients or customers. So basically the RJPs provide these potential candidates about both the positive and negative aspects of their job. And so they're very clear in terms of what the organization will provide. What is the pay? How many hours do they have to work? Is there any flexibility in the schedule? What is the sort of culture which is there in the organization? And is the company expecting late hours from them? What sort of interaction does he have to have with customers? What is the physical risk, for instance, if at all there is any? So, and basically it shows that the candidates who have experienced the realistic job reviews, there is a companies typically experience a retention of as much as 10%. At the same time, there are various research studies which have shown that by going through this whole RJP, they essentially weed out or screen out about 15 to 35% of the applicants rather. So that is something which is good because you don't want to have employees joining you and leaving you instantly because they somehow feel that the job is not what they expected. The third part of the screening is the psychometric testing, essentially to gather details in terms of the personality traits of a particular individual and essentially what their attitude is to determine whether there is a cultural fit between the employee and the company. And there are various such vendors who are available to administer these tests. And you could either have it at an assessment center or you can have it inside the company's premises also. And these tests can measure, the interests, the personalities, and the aptitudes. Now, basically, the interest test will measure how the people differ in their motivation, their values and opinions in relation to their interests. Personality is how they react to various situations. What is the sort of style that is exhibited by that particular type? Does he have a very docile sort of attitude or is he a very aggressive sort of personality? And also the aptitude is basically what is the ability to carry on various of these tasks. So these are basically the psychometric tests which are available. So they're basically conducted either in the assessment center and you can also observe and rate the performance based on real life work-based sort of scenarios. Now the other forms of screening are essentially these aptitude tests or you could have a group discussion and on a particular topic or the case study. Now if you look at interviews and onboarding, basically, I think gone are the times where the candidate has to be physically, travel from one location to another for interviewing. The number of technologies which are available, you can either do it through video conferencing or Skype, and the advanced software and applications such as TeamViewer. You could have interactions with the candidates, and if you look at the onboarding, for instance, where as many companies are becoming globally relevant, this becomes a very important aspect and is a very challenging part also. Now, providing these new employees the necessary skills or the knowledge and the sort of behaviors to become effective in their roles requires a sustained learning strategy, which basically has to provide instant access to training and resources from anywhere in the world. So that is what this whole virtual onboarding is. So with this virtual onboarding, you can provide live and on-demand training classes, tools, resources. You can have instructor-led or the peer-to-peer mentoring to ensure that the employees have full knowledge about the company's corporate culture and are ready to take on the role. Now, for instance, we look at Marriott's voyage. Basically, the Marriott group worked with one of these consultants to create the virtual learning environment. It's called as Voyage, that basically creates and provides easy access to training and resources that the new recruits need to be successful in this company. So basically, they have social learning tools with the traditional learning management systems. Now, for instance, if they want to, know more about, what was discussed in the town hall by the, heads of the company, then they can click there and understand what is there. The other is also in terms of, the learning library, in terms of, what is available there and what are the things that they need to do. Because typically it's found that the entire documentation process for a new recruit typically will take a day's time. So I think by doing all of these, I think that time is also cut short and also becomes very easy for employees to enmesh themselves within the corporate culture pretty quickly rather than going through a process after they come on board into the company. So this is something which is Marriott has done pretty successfully. So if you look at the talent relationship management, I think one of the important aspects or the aims of this will be to build a positive candidate experience and manage the entire community of candidates and also maintain the relationship. Because if you cut your relationships or leave a bitter taste in the minds of the candidates, then it is something that word can go around and that can have a bad impact on your future recruitment. And you also, I think companies increasingly are looking at covering candidates who are not selected or employees who have left the services of the company. Typically, you'll find that there is a big alumni. I think LinkedIn or the company has its own alumni sort of links in their website, basically to be in touch with their employees who have left. And in many cases, you have found that employees have come back to their alma mater after many years. Earlier, it was taboo to re-recruit someone who has left the services, but I think those days have changed. Where typically you find that even if people have left, and for a reason, then they have come back. I think employers have welcomed them, and basically, the idea of any talent relationship management is to ensure that you're engaging with the available talent of bright people, whether that particular position exists or not, because that position might open up at a later point in time. And if it does, and if you already engage with a set of people who might fit in that bill, then your task becomes all the more easier. And I think the most important benefit that any company would get is to ensure that the turnaround time for the recruitment process becomes extremely reduced, largely because you have the talent pipeline available with you, because you've nurtured that relationship over a period of time. We now move on to the applicant tracking system. Basically, with the requirement of manpower increasing quite dramatically, basically various companies have devised their own tracking system, which essentially addresses their recruitment needs in a very electronic, in an electronically set up system. And the benefits would be in terms of one is to track the resumes, the candidates, and their contacts more effectively through a software application, and it need not be restricted only to large companies. I think smaller companies who are in growth mode will also have the need to develop these systems, and these are very similar to the CRM, or the customer relationship management system. So essentially, the data is either collected from the internal applications, uh, or it's extracted from applications on various of these job sites, and the majority of these job and resume boards, whether it's Monster or Hot Jobs, etc., have partnerships with the software providers, basically to sift and data, and also to enable data migration from one system to the other system. And as I mentioned, some of these recent enhancements like artificial intelligence or semantic searches, etc., are also inbuilt there. And again, it's all done through the cloud-based platforms. So basically, to facilitate better sorting and better shortlisting of candidates in tune with what the job requirements are. So many applications are there. For instance, there is Open Hire, or there's Smart Recruiters, or Zoho. So these are some of the applicants which can be used. So this is what I was talking to you earlier about the alumni portal. For instance, Unilever, for instance, has an alumni portal. Basically, it's a forum for the alumni to interact, and also to keep them abreast of happenings in the company, and also provide career opportunities there. So I think that is something which becomes important. I think a number of companies have these alumni portals, and it serves as a tool for them to be in touch, and also in case they are reinterested in the company, they can always come back and rejoin the company. Now comes another concept. Basically, it is the crowdsourcing. Now, crowdsourcing is essentially uh, a form of attraction of talent by inviting these social followers to participate in some sort of idea generation, or ideation. It could be for a new product development, or it could be for innovation of some services. Now, for instance, Amazon or Cisco or Facebook, Pepsi, Starbucks, these are all examples of companies which have used crowdsourcing techniques at one point or the other, basically to generate ideas that have already or are expected to turn into a new product and service innovations. So this is something which are basically distributed, so that people are coming back with their ideas and solutions, and there is constant engagement with the bright talent. It is not a direct automatic hiring system. It is only a form of attraction, so that you're able to identify some bright spots, because there'll be someone who will come up with a brilliant marketing idea, or a brilliant product idea. So this particular candidate will stand out, and also high visibility for the employer. I think that's one of the important visibility points that you get. And the third is, from an employer's point of view, you're able to assess the candidate in a live sort of manner. Now, for instance, Times of India, for instance, when they wanted to launch a particular edition or another version of their newspaper, they've gone to some of the premier business schools, and had sort of done this entire idea generation. Now, I think some of the ideas which some of these students had put out is what ultimately the company had adopted when they did this launch of their new paper. So that is something which is done. And there is a survey which the research arm of timesjobs.com had done, which essentially showed that about 57% of the employers used crowdsourcing for recruitment purposes. So therefore, it becomes a very important tool for employers to source bright candidates. The other important concept is called as gamification. Now, gamification is essentially using the concept of employing the game mechanics into non-game activities such as recruitment, training, and health and wellness. So, according to there's a research by Gartner, which is the IT research firm, they predicted that over 70% of the Forbes 2000 organization will have at least one of these gamified applications by 2014. And what happens is the candidates are invited to take part in a variety of online challenges, and it is largely used by the marketing fraternity. For instance, some of the attributes which are tested by these games will be things like strategic thinking or organization, problem solving, multitasking, and so on and so forth. So typically, you'll find that the Marriott hotels and the L'Oreal set of cosmetics, they use this gamification to a greater extent. For instance, through these games, you can figure out whether a person has aggressive marketing strategy. Let's say there's a car racing game which is built in certain attributes there. If somebody is able to demonstrate a very aggressive attitude, which might be required for that particular job, then he might be the right sort of candidates that the company is looking at. So essentially, this is something which has been done. I think those of you who have time, we can actually get into something called as I think My Marriott Hotel as a hotel-themed online game, wherein what basically the game talks about is where players have to juggle all the responsibilities of a hotel kitchen manager. So basically, they're trying to figure out whether a particular candidate has all the skill sets which are required for a kitchen manager. And in that process, they try to ensure that the users get acquainted with the industry and also find out whether they have multi-tasking capabilities and the skills which are required for that. So basically, so this is something which is done, and I think over a period of time, it is said that many of these are going to be linked on to the social platforms such as LinkedIn, many of the job portals like Monster and Facebook, and so on and so forth. So basically, this is some of the newer techniques that they use. We now move on to recruitment metrics. Now, having said all this, what are the various recruitment metrics that needs to be followed or adopted by companies? Obviously, the numbers will vary from company to company depending on the size of the employee base and the number of people who are there. And the idea is to ensure that there is continuous improvement and the recruitment decisions are made better, so that the quality of people whom you hire is also much better. So the first one is the turnaround time, TAT, or the time to fill. Now, typically, you would like to fill in people as quickly as possible, but typically, if you look at the time to fill, every day that a particular position is open, you are going to be losing money, and if you're not going to be filling up that, it becomes a very serious business issue. So the faster you fill, the better the business is able to cope up with it. And the important thing here is typically for senior positions, obviously this time to fill is going to take some time. So while for the lower level employees, maybe 1 month is an acceptable number. Maybe for senior level recruits or specific positions, you will find that this has to be a lot higher. It can even go up to 2 months. The second important thing is offer to acceptance ratio, which essentially indicates the number of offers that are made to fill in a particular position. So obviously a good ratio is 1:1. So if you offer one position and that person is joined, it's a good number to have. But in reality, it does not happen that way for various reasons. So some of the indicators are, let's say if the higher offer rejection, if the rejection rates are very high, it means that there is something which is going wrong in the entire process. So maybe the company has to revisit the strategies. It might have to, look at the compensation package a little differently, or there could be a problem with the visibility of the company or the branding of the company. So these are numbers which you need to look at. The third important thing is the source of hire. Essentially helps track the number of applicants against each source. It can be walk-in, it can be through ads, it can be through social media and so on and so forth. And I think one of the important things is to do an exercise at the end of the recruitment to find out which method yielded the best results for a particular position or a particular department. For all you know, the social networking might yield a better result for a particular position, whereas something else might yield a better result for that particular position. So therefore, the advantage of that is it will help the company in the future to target that particular mode of hiring and thereby make the recruitment process faster and also make the costs lower from a recruitment point of view. So that is again the source of hire and the application rate. Then comes obviously the cost of hire. So essentially from a budgeting perspective and the financial perspective, the cost of per hire becomes a very important parameter, because you need to be able to provide that when the annual budgets are made. So it will also help the company to track how effective they have been from a recruiting perspective. So typically the sort of expenditure or the cost elements that you look at would be the advertising fee, the job posting, the headhunter's fee. It could be employee referrals. In some cases you might have the prospective employee traveling, so there might be a travel fee attached to it. Or there could be an internal recruiter costs, the admin costs, relocation costs, and so on and so forth. So if it's a replacement position, then you will get to know what the organization is spending in terms of getting a replacement for that particular position. Then comes the quality of hire. I think it's very, very important to know this. Now, the entire process of this whole talent acquisition will be a failure in case the quality of hire becomes very poor. And how do you determine it? Obviously, you determine it based on the performance appraisal of the candidate. And if the candidate is scored well below what is an acceptable level, it means that, or a bulk of them, a majority of them have been scoring it, it means that the entire process has not been done properly. So you've sort of hurried through this whole process and not gone through it diligently. Now this is all assuming that the rest of your training, etc., and the other needs are all done in a normal and efficient manner. So these are the things that I think it is important. While there are no hard numbers for, obviously given the multitude of companies that we have, some of the numbers will be something which you will have to develop, and it can be tracked across various sectors. For instance, if you're looking at IT companies, and obviously you can try and figure out how one is. Obviously, many of these numbers will not be published or shared, but you can get an idea of some of these. There's an interesting now coming back to how the SMEs are. I think there's an interesting study by the McKinsey Global Institute, and they had looked at almost about 5,000 small and medium enterprises in 13 countries. Basically, they were trying to ascertain what is the importance of the internet for an SME. Now, based on their findings, obviously, I think all of us know that internet is a very critical element of growth. And based on their study, they had found out that the internet had contributed almost about 11% of the growth in the last 5 years. And the SMEs who had their presence in the internet had grown twice as much as those who did not have a presence on the web. And that is very similar to what the other sectors also had experienced. And they also created twice the number of jobs as the others because of the sort of growth that they had exhibited. So obviously the conclusion is that if you're not going to keep pace with technology and not having a presence there, then competition is going to hit you very hard, and you will enter that last phase in that 4 phases that we talked about earlier on, and maybe reach the decline phase pretty quickly. So the conclusion is to have a very strong web presence as far as the SMEs are concerned. So what do SMEs need to do to attract talent? And one is very critical need for SMEs to market themselves quite aggressively. And if you ask me, I think SME offers an excellent learning environment, and I think a lot of first-hand experience that you perhaps may not get in a larger sort of organization. There are a number of day-to-day issues and situations that are faced by SMEs, and that is something that employees will get exposed to. They will be able to look at those challenges and address those challenges, and will also lead to faster decision-making capabilities and promote their growth within the company. So I think that marketing effort is something which is very, very important. And as I mentioned earlier, that brand awareness becomes very, very important. And I think there are a number of examples of SMEs that I can tell you which are, good brands now. For instance, if you look at in Chennai, for instance, there was this Kumbat Holograms, which basically, started as a small SME. Today, I think they've branded themselves so well that, if you look at holograms, you will talk of them. Or if you look at the inverters, for instance, SUCAM is the name which comes to mind because it's something that is a brand which has been promoted quite aggressively by them. So, you will go and ask for that particular sort of inverter. And I think one should remember that all large companies were, SMEs at some point in time. So I think the brand building exercise is something that becomes important. And you need to have, as they grow, obviously, with 4 or 5 employees, you cannot create a brand and become brand ambassadors. But slowly, once you create that, then the employees will have to become brand ambassadors for your company. Social media, I think that needs, it doesn't cost much. Relationships with educational institutions, I think, becomes very important. And participation in various of these industrial forums and industrial fairs and technology fairs. That is where not only will you get business, but you'll also be able to slowly attract talent. Because there might be some SMEs who are really good on the technology front. So you might look at participating in these fairs and forums where you will be able to attract good talent. So to summarize, ensure that there is a business goal alignment of all the talent acquisition practices. I think the idea of this entire budgeting process is to link and pull together all the various facets in the organization, including HR. So obviously this entire talent acquisition strategy has to mesh with the overall strategy of the company. For instance, if you're a small company, you don't need to get into these applicant tracking systems, for instance, where that is not required for you. But as you grow, you should be able to invest. So the investment has to be in pace with how the company is growing, and the recruitment or the talent acquisition strategies will also have to be in place with what the business demands. For instance, the next 2-3 years, this is the growth that you expect and these are the sort of people. I think you need to start planning for that right ahead. You cannot one fine day get up and decide to look for people. The second important thing is, before you embrace any new technology, you look at the maturity of the process. Do you really need a new technology or not, just because somebody is using it? So that is something that you have to take care of it. And as I mentioned earlier, the subscription to various of these social media platforms becomes very important compared to traditional advertising methods. And I think there are many companies who may not even advertise in the newspapers today. It's all on the web and various postings there. That's something that I'm sure many of you would have noticed. I think many of you from your own company would have also adopted those sort of practices. The fourth is to ensure that the validity and the integrity of information in the recruitment databases, and that is something which is possible only with regular interaction with the talent pool that you have. Another important thing is to ensure that you invest initially in the in-house recruitment team rather than outsource recruitment requirements, because you're in the initial phase of your activity and you understand the business much better than somebody else, and you can therefore source candidates who fit in with your culture and who fit in with your requirements. Also, have a constant dialogue with the talent pool, even if there is no recruitment mandate. And I think it serves this purpose of this whole brand creation, which becomes very important both from your business point of view as also from a talent acquisition point of view. And also the recruitment has to be planned, especially in the sort of SME, given all the handicaps that it has from a talent acquisition perspective. The people whom you recruit should have some scope to move up in the organization. It shouldn't happen that, let's say there's a promoter and he recruited a team of people and the promoter is constantly taking decisions. Then what are these people recruited for? So you'll find them leaving after 1 or 2 years. So there has to be a path which is laid out for them. And that is something which you will have to consciously work with. And track recruitment efficacy with metrics. You need to keep tracking that. And I think as one of the important points that I mentioned in one of the earlier slides is, what is the sort of rejection that is experienced? That becomes a very important tool. It means that something is wrong with the company. So you identify those problems and try and rectify the situation. So I think that is from the presentation side of it. So maybe we can start taking the questions from now on. Okay, I think okay, I think there are some questions which are already okay, popped up there. Okay, I think there are a number of questions. Let me just start with it. And I think the first question that I think Krishna Karthik has asked is, who can be the interviewer? Same job level person can do the interview. So that basically depends on time to time. Now earlier on it was believed that only the immediate superior can do the recruitment. But in today's context, you find that people at the same level are also, let's say when you talk of level, let's say if there's someone who's at the manager level, people in the manager level also come with different levels of experience. You can have someone with 5 years, right, up to 10 or 12 years. So that is something that, there is no taboo that people at the same level cannot interview. They can very well, interview the candidate. Okay, someone has talked about, can we hire without a relieving letter? No, I think a good practice is to get the relieving letter. That's a set of documentation that you will get. Before you finally, get the person on board in terms of doing his day-to-day work in the office. Okay, so that is that part of it. I think Mr. Balasubramanian asked, is it more on the IT industry, not manufacturing industry? Now, there is no particular industry focus as far as the presentation is concerned. I think the whole idea of this presentation is to familiarize with some of the newer concepts of talent acquisition. So this is something which can be universally adopted with both the whether it's the IT sector or the manufacturing sector. So maybe if you're looking at the worker level or the workforce sort of level, maybe some of these may not be required. Maybe some parts of it, like your mass recruitment, etc., is something that will be relevant there. I think Muthu Kumaran has asked a question in terms of what could be the meaningful cycle time for talent acquisition. Now, you should remember that talent acquisition, as I said, is it's a strategic sort of function. So if you look at, if you're looking at, and recruitment is one part of it. So if you're looking at talent acquisition, it can be, as high as many years, because it is built. Let's say that you have a plan of, you don't have an immediate plan of recruiting a particular position, but then at a strategic level, you're interacting and creating those sort of platforms where you can hire a person when that opening happens. So it can even mean years. Whereas when you look at recruitment and you're looking to recruit a person at a point in time, where we talk about some of these metrics, the turnaround time, then that period can be as short as 30 days or 60 days. Okay. Okay, a lot of interesting questions. So let me just go to the next one. I think Mr. Keshavan has asked a question. What is the oversell? Please explain. When you talk of oversell, what does it mean? It means that you are talking a lot more about the company and the sort of job that is on hand than what actually the job position and the company is all about. With the sense that you are somehow trying to rope in that candidate into your company. It is more to do with saying that maybe giving them a picture which is not actually the true picture. It's like painting a very rosy picture of the company when the picture is not as rosy as it is. And also talking a lot more about the job description when the actual job profile is not as what it seems to be. Okay. I think Ms. Blenure has asked share the PPT. I think the PPT will be available on the website myci.in. So I think along with I think somebody else had asked about the video recording. So I think that will also be available there. Okay. I think S.C. Anthony has asked a question. Is there any technique to minimize the memory fade? Now the technique is fairly simple. Obviously, let's say if it's going to be, I think one of the techniques which you need to do is, obviously you will have an assessment sheet in front of you when the interview process is done. So that is one of the techniques, because obviously when you're going to be interviewing a number of candidates, you're not going to be able to recollect in detail about each and every candidate in that measure. So obviously you will have certain parameters which are laid out for that particular job role or job profile. So how you stack up on each of those parameters, you can have a ranking or a rating from each of that and an overall rating, something that is commonly adapted, which can sort of minimize the memory fade. Okay, I think Raghavendra has asked a question. When talking about gamification, I think, okay, just a second. I think Mr. Raghavendra asked a question. When talking about gamification, you told about the Kitchen Manager game. Can I know the exact name to Google it out? I think where you need to go is okay, you can go, the game is, I think you need to go to that site and get on to My Marriott Hotel. and I think I think you can figure it out from there. Okay. Okay, I think Mr. Balasubramaniam has asked a question. What is gamification, and he needs some more clarity. Okay. So basically, it's employment of game mechanics into this whole recruitment process. Now, what are they trying to do? They're trying to find out if there are certain traits or challenges which are present in that particular candidate, which they can be used by the company. Now, for instance, in marketing, see when you play a game, let's say a car game, right? I'm sure some of you know, are good at gaming. Now, what happens in a car game? You find that there are certain people who use some of those controls very fast and move through that maze very fast. Now, what happens to everybody else? You think that okay, he's moving fast and trying to reach that goal, but there is an underlying character in each of those. So when you're in a game situation, you're your normal self or true self. So that is the underlying principle. So when you're driving fast and going through all those mazes, it means that you're a very pushy or an aggressive sort of person. So that is what the game tries to pull out. They try and pull out some of those traits in you, which can be used by potential recruiters to decide whether you're the right person for that candidate or not. Now, for instance, when you look at, I think that Marriott game, that game basically tries to find out whether the kitchen manager is able to cope up with hundreds of things he has to do. There must be hundreds of things happening in the kitchen, various dishes that are, made there, the ingredients, some of it might be there, he has to talk to so many people. How are you able to tackle or multitask many of those events is what that game is trying to tell you. Now, for instance, if you look at this My Marriott Hotel on Facebook, you can play that game by selecting the language from a variety of languages that are there. And you start managing that virtual kitchen. Now, what they do is, why is Marriott put out in various languages? Because they believe that much of their business is going to happen in most of these countries outside of the US. It could be China, it could be, many of those countries. And they want to look at age group of 18 to 27 to attract them into this hospitality careers. So one of the things that they have decided is many of these games, and who uses, I think maybe the sort of population that uses Facebook and others will be largely in this age group of 18 to 27. So as they do it, they might show interest in the hospitality industry and may become the potential candidates. So that is what this whole gamification is. Okay, I think let me just finish Mr. Balasubramanian's other questions. I think he has also asked, what is this artificial intelligence in screening? Artificial intelligence in screening means how do you pull out the sort of information or the resumes or the application that you need from an available job portal, for which you use various of these techniques. You might use, as I gave you that example, let's say that you want somebody for a sales position. There will be certain programs or certain applications there which will use certain tag words. For instance, you might use a word like, a sales manager or a business development manager or a marketing manager or a development manager. So by using some of those, you will be able to sift out the right sort of resumes. Or you use certain semantics, which will mean certain set of keywords that will be used in that particular program. See, all of these are programmer driven. For instance, you can use things like programmer or software engineer or developer for that matter, if you want to source those sort of resumes. Okay, I think there's a lot of interest in this, the whole gamification. Okay, I'll just take this question and then go on to the other question. How to make people play the game? So the gamification will bring out the real trait. It is believed that gamification will bring out the real trait. Maybe you should try it out yourself. So when you do a game, I think whether it's a car game or if you have played PC Man or any of those games, you will find that, or cricket for that matter, I think, okay, those are games that I know. I don't play any of these games. But there they are supposed to bring out the true traits of an individual. Okay. Okay, Mr. Balasubramanian has another question, and after that I will move to the other question. One is the recruitment metrics. I think this question is the offer to acceptance ratio. Explain it once more. Now, what does it mean? It means that what is the sort of ratio that I have? Let's say if I make one offer, okay, is that one offer being accepted by the candidate? It means that if there's accepted, it means good. Let's say that I make 50 offers and only 2 have accepted, 48 have declined. So what does it mean? It means that there's a lot of recruitment cost which has gone wasted. There's a lot of time which has been wasted. And there is something fundamentally wrong with this whole HR strategy that the company has put out. It can mean there's something wrong with the brand. It can mean that there's something wrong with the image of the company. It can mean that the company is a bad paymaster. It can mean many things. So the company will have to go back and rediscover itself to find out what it has to do to overcome that strategy. So that is what that will throw up. Or is the competition doing better than me? Are they doing something better? Do I need to alter something that I need to do? So the various things that you can do. So that is what it. Okay. Now let me go back to some of the earlier questions. Okay, I think Mr. Karnam Balaji has a question. If SME has to ramp up on new technology, how to get the interview support for the lined up candidates, which is a major challenge for. Can you just explain the question once more? I'm not very clear what you're looking at. Okay, now how to sustain a pipeline of interested candidates? I think that is what I talked about. I think a number of those methods that we talked about crowdsourcing, for instance, is a good way of keeping interested candidates there on board, wherein certain projects or certain case studies, etc., are given from time to time. So that is one way of doing it. The other thing also is to constantly engage. I think you need to keep visiting, campuses from time to time. If you're looking at, freshers there, have marketing fairs there, or have, seminars, attend seminars there. So those are ways that you can do to keep candidates engaged, and also, the sort of projects that you can give from time to time. It can be as simple as a case study or a product ideation that you want a feedback on. So that is something that can be done quite effectively. I think Mr. Sandeep has asked a question. Is there a formula to measure quality of hire? Which is what I said. How do you measure quality of hire? The quality of hire can be measured through the entire performance appraisal process. That process will have to be done not immediately. It has to be done after the candidate has spent some time in the organization. Maybe at the end of 1 year, or maybe at the end of 6 months or 9 months, to see how these candidates have performed and how they have sort of adjusted to the culture and how they have performed on the job. So that is a measure of the recruitment quality of hire. Now let's say that out of 50 people, let's say 40 people fell in the below average sort of category. It means that either something is wrong with this whole recruitment process, or your in-house training is faulty, or there is some fundamental problem in the entire division or department. That is how you will sort of measure the quality of hire. Okay, I think Ms. Lakshmi Rao has said, can you display the question being asked by the other participants? I don't think that is possible with this technology. That's why I'm reading out the question and who is asking the question. Okay. Ms. Lakshmi has another question. What are the parameters to be arrived at to look at cost per hire? Yeah, which is what I had outlined, I think, when I spoke also. Let me just run you through that. I think the cost per hire, what you need to focus, that you need to look at would be the advertising fees to the extent that it is relevant. The job posting, the recruiting agency, basically the headhunters, if there's an employee referral for that particular hire, relocation fee, the cost that you attribute to the HR team of internal recruiters, and the admin costs. So those are the things that you will do. Whether HR team can advise on brand building, I think question by Krupa Shankar. Obviously, the HR team will, I think its role also is to advise on the brand building, because from a company's perspective, there are many benefits. One is the brand awareness is important for the company's business. Second, you're able to communicate the company's values and the sort of objectives that the company has. So I think from a business perspective, it becomes important. Third, the ease with which you're able to attract talent if you have a good brand becomes very important, and therefore you're able to firstly cut down costs, and secondly able to recruit the right sort of people at the time that you want. Let's say you need a very specialized position to be filled up, and if you don't get the person on time, you might end up losing business and thereby losing on your profit generating objective. So obviously HR team can advise on that. I think Mr. Balaji has another question. Is role playing a gamification process? When you talk of gamification, it is a simulated game. Whereas role playing is you're trying to play on the role, which has nothing to do with the game. So it has nothing. So it is not a part of the gamification process. Okay, I think Karnam has another question. To continue the interview support, we'd like to have someone to interview these candidates, since we do not have an internal panel who has the specific technical skills and do the technical assessment. Obviously, you can, in case you do not have the person, obviously you can hire a consultant who can do the job of the entire process. I think if you look at my first, consulting assignment itself, which I had actually done for an SME, it was one of organization restructuring, where since some of these people did not have the skills in finance and organizational behavior and stuff like that, actually I had designed the entire interview process. So you do have consultants who can fill in the role of doing this interview process for you. It can be a technical, or it can be finance, or it can be in any of these sectors. Sachin Kapoor has a very good question. How to reduce the attrition for field and pharma sector? I wish I knew the answer, but I think, again, what do you say? I think it has to do, again, with creating this whole awareness about, what the company does, what its value position is in the organization, how are the employees taken care of, what are the, obviously salary is one part of it. The other part of it also is how the employees are, feeling part of the organization. What are the things that a company does to make the employees feel that they are part of the organization becomes a very key element. So if that feeling is created and there's a growth path for the employees, then this incremental salary of 1,000 and 2,000 and 5,000 will not make much of a difference. There's a clear path that you show to the employees that this is the path that you have. And obviously much of this attrition can come down. Obviously salary is a big motivator. But, despite that, there are many people who are, let's say, many of these startup companies, you will find that people stay on, although the initial salaries are lower, because they find a big growth potential, and the possibility of them occupying a very high position in a short span of time also is something which they are able to see. So many of them will not be leaving. So it has happened to a lot of us also in our careers that, you might start off in a company where the salary levels are not very high, but let's say a comparable peer is earning maybe 2 times. But over a period of time, there's a growth in the company, and obviously you're the first one to benefit. It is easiest talked about, but then for people to understand and accept it, it's not very easy. And that's where a lot of these attrition happens. Okay. Yeah, I think Krupa Shankar has another question whether talent acquisition can be for fresher. Obviously, it can be for a fresher. I think that ITC example that I gave you is something which is a live example, where, they had come up, not ITC, I think it was Times of India that I gave you, where, they wanted to actually launch another paper somewhere else. And obviously people in these business schools and engineering colleges like to be involved in real life case situations. And they would like their solutions to be heard by senior people in the organization. So obviously there is a big rush for such companies which have a strong presence in many of these colleges. So it is for a fresher also. Because there you find that the recruitment may not be immediate, but then it happens over a period of time. I think Karnam Balaji is another question. Okay, gamification examples relating to recruitment or HR department. Obviously, that example of Marriott that I gave you was basically to recruit those kitchen managers only across the globe. So that is an example of that. Okay. Okay, I think Mr. Sachin is, sorry, I think his question came in early, but I'm taking it up a little later. So suppose some company does not have Facebook or other social network, what other tools can it be used to brand the company image regarding? See, if it's an SME company, as I told you, some of the brand awareness techniques could be in terms of, see, firstly, it doesn't cost much to have a presence on any of these social networking media. So I don't understand why SME should not use it as a first option. Secondly, I think if they want to create a brand image, they have to necessarily participate in these industry fairs, these industry expos, the industry, the meets which happen from time to time. And I think it is very important. Actually, in another training program in SMEs, I would have said that, but since you asked this, a lot of these SMEs get a number of incentives from both the state government and central government to participate in these fairs, and also assistance for marketing their products and so on and so forth. So those are tools that they can use to create a brand for themselves. Brand creation is not done overnight. It has to be done over a sustained period of time. Okay, I think Mr. Balasubramaniam has a question. I think challenges faced by SME is not a good paymaster. How to overcome this and get a perfect talent? Now, obviously, it is not. It is one of the serious challenges that they have, and it is something which is not a very easy task for SMEs to be doing. And therefore, they have to create this whole, what shall I say, this whole value proposition about some of the other things that I mentioned in the presentation. One, in terms of the sort of challenges that they will get exposed to, the day-to-day challenges, the sort of decision-making abilities that they will get to do. Over a period of time, they will find that as SMEs grow, they will find that they are better equipped to occupy a senior manager position than some of their comparable peers, because you've gone through this whole exercise much earlier than some of the other comparable colleagues who have taken up positions in larger companies. So this is something that you need to create and also demonstrate when the people or persons actually join your organization. So it is not something which is very easily done, but this is something that you need to keep, and it's for them to come and see in the organization. And you should not make false promises that he'll be doing this and that, and he or she will not be staying beyond a week or a month. So you have to live with the values and the challenges that you propose to the employee. Obviously, someone who sees, and you should also be able to share the outline of what your business growth plans are. Without that, I don't think anyone is even going to look at you. Okay. Okay, I think SC has a question. How can we ensure that a degree is from a genuine university? Okay, I think what you need to do is, obviously you will know over a period of time, you have a master list of, obviously, the number of colleges and universities which are cropping up. I think one of the things is, obviously they have their own affiliations. So you firstly need to check out whether university is something which is genuine, has the necessary approvals and the necessary registration from various of these ministries and Directorate of Education or Technical Education. Now, having done that, if you're going to be recruiting somebody from the university for the first time, not only even if you've outsourced it, you need to physically verify and find out if that university is a genuine university yourself. by checking at various of these approvals and looking at whether it is part of the all India AICT and so on and so forth. So that check you need to do initially. Now, if you find that there is a slight loophole or certain things are not being followed, or certain approvals are not got, or they're still waiting for something, then I don't think you should even look at candidates from that university. So it is a process which is going to be painful for the first time, but it is worth the effort. You find that many of these consulates, you find that many of these software professionals go armed with various of these certificates from universities or marks from various universities. You find that sometimes it has slipped past and they've got their visas to go, but many times when there's a doubt, they have been checked and rechecked by the consulates themselves. So a very similar process is what we need to follow. Again, how to ensure that a relieving letter is genuine? Okay, good question. Now, again, if you have doubts, I think recently you might have read, okay, I need to give you that exam. I'm sure some of you would have read it in the paper. I think not relieving letter is a joining letter. I think it came in the paper a couple of weeks back. Now this is, I think, happened in Bombay. So basically KPMG had their office in the 8th or 10th floor. Now what some of these fake recruiters did was, they said that they were recruiters from KPMG. So they taken up a small room or space in the ground floor of that entire building. And what they did was, they had given out their appointment letters and told each candidate you have to pay an X amount for each of these job offers. They collected the money. When the candidates went to KPMG to actually tell them that we have come to join, they told them there are no such positions and these letters are not original. So by the time they discovered and went down, these people had wound up and left the place. So that is the sort of thing that you find for joining. So when you look at relieving letter again, see, obviously in big time recruitment, or if you're going to be recruiting a number of people, obviously you can't keep checking each and every candidate's relieving letter, but you should have a sampling way of checking out what is genuine or not, maybe by calling up and checking out whether this particular candidate had left the company. So it's only a sampling that you can do at best. Okay. How and what incentive can be given to the HR team by Sachin? This question is by Sachin Kapoor. Now, incentives, obviously, what is the HR team's roles and responsibility is something which is very well clearly outlined. So I think that is their job role. Now, when you look at incentives, it depends on what the performance measures are. Now, if the performance measures, obviously they have a certain set of performance measures. Now, if you're part of this, the talent acquisition team, these are your performance measures. So if you've obviously, done your job, exceeded your job performance, then obviously depending on what the company's philosophy is. Let's say if you have a variable pay bonus element as part of your salary structure, and if you've exceeded performance, then you will be rewarded appropriately. So I think another question which has come up is the difference between job duties, KRS, and the supervisory and fiscal. So essentially, if you look at the job duties and KRS, they're basically one and the same in terms of what the job expectations are, what is the role, what are the basic tasks that you have to do, what are the duties you have to do, and the responsibilities that you have to do. So that is essentially the job duties and KRS. So essentially, they mean one and the same. If you look at what are the supervisory and fiscal responsibilities, when you talk of fiscal responsibility, it means that what are the sanctioning powers that you have? For instance, the responsibility, the budgetary responsibility that you can take certain decisions up to a particular level. Let's say you want to go on a particular recruitment campaign, your particular level, let's say you're authorized, it's 10 lakhs. Then that 10 lakhs is what you will be entitled to spend at your level. Let's say if it's 20 lakhs, then obviously you have to take the permission of somebody else. So if you look at supervisory responsibility, it means that who are the people and how many people are you supervising from time to time in terms of the numbers. Okay, I think Colonel Krishna Kumar has a question. We are an audiovisual industry and have a good retention ratio. However, many of those who leave us turn out to become competitors. Bigger companies attract them with much higher salaries. What do you advise to face these challenges? Okay, I think this is what I had mentioned in that stage of the SMEs. I think the 4 stages that we had. Now, typically, this is what will happen in the second or the third stage. Ideally, I think it would normally happen at the third stage of the operations, where they start leaving and setting up your competing setups. Now, how do you retain them? Obviously, again, you have to show them a path. I think once you have reached that stage of this harvest, I think obviously the person who's leaving also knows that the company is doing well and there is a bright future for the company. So that bright future growth path is something that you need to outline and share with the set of employees. Now, obviously, there are certain employees in a company that you don't want them to leave because you think that they are critical to them. So for those employees, you need to definitely be able to show a growth path. Otherwise, they start getting restless and they will start looking at greener pastures to live in. Now, see, salary is one part of it. Now, see, beyond a particular point in time, I think the responsibilities start outweighing the salary because they know that salary is something which will get taken care of. But in the initial phase, let's say when you have toiled hard for 3-4 years in a company and then you suddenly find that you're not getting the responsibility and the salary for the sort of experience that you bring in, then obviously they will start looking out. So it's important for the owner of or the promoter or the top executive to be able to articulate what the growth path is. So if that is identified and then you're clearly demonstrating that by action, then you may not have this problem of okay, V. Srinivas Moti has left the discussion. I think his question is, the candidate was found good during the interview, but his background verification shows is negative. What is your decision? My decision will not be to hire him at all, because I cannot risk the reputation of the company for a candidate whose background check has become negative. I think comes Raghavendra Raju as another question. How to overcome the challenge of not good pay masses with the lesser cash revenues of SMEs in comparison to the bigger MNCs, which is what I mentioned earlier. I think the ability to show the growth path for them and demonstrate it and follow it and back it up with action is something that you need to do. I think that is the only way that you can bridge that gap, and also showcasing the sort of challenges that can be faced with and giving them. I think it's one thing is saying all that, the other thing is demonstrating it by action. In many SMEs, the problem is the promoter, despite saying all this. I know of an SME where I was involved in some organization restructuring, where along with the promoter, as they were growing, maybe it was a 30 crore company, the company is going to a 150 crore company. So they needed people at various levels because the promoter's time was being eaten away by people who were asking him all sorts of mundane questions. So with great difficulty, we hired a marketing head, the operations head, and maybe a finance head also, with the view that everything will be delegated to them and they will be doing their duties. They also had a very nicely created performance-based salary structure. But even after 1 year after, you go and see the company, you find that the promoter is still taking all the decisions, leaving these people wondering, why they even joined this company, because none of the decisions or none of the suggestions that these senior people are giving were taken into consideration by their fellow employees. So they know that decisions were still given only by the promoter. So if such a situation happens, then obviously you're not going to be able to get any people into your company. I think Ms. Archana is saying the same page is shown from the last 30 minutes. I'm not moving the presentation, I'm only taking your questions. Okay. I think Karnam Balaji is a question. What is the acceptable level of attrition in the IT industry? I think as low as possible. I think the average, if I'm not mistaken, is about 13 to 15% is what is exhibited by some of the larger companies. How many interviews are required to select senior level positions? Okay, that's a good question. Now, the number of interviews there can be ranging anywhere between 2 to 4, depending on how big the company is, how many layers of people there are above this particular position. So it can even be as few as 2 or 3. So that entirely depends on how that company is. I think Ms. Lavanya has a question. Can you brief us about ATS? So basically, ATS is nothing but how efficiently you track your applications and the applicants that you have. Now, how does it work? So as I mentioned there, it basically is a software that you have to track the various applications in terms of handling the recruitment needs. Now, basically, it is like a database of all the applicants that you have and how you want to pull out the resumes depending on a particular position that that opens up in the company, and you either collect it through whatever application that have come into your company internally, or whatever comes to your website, or those that you pull out from various of these job sites. So that is what this whole applicant tracking system is. So ease of identifying the applications which are relevant to that position which opens up. Okay, I think so Jayachandran has a question between what is role sheet and what is goal sheet. When you talk of role, it means that these are your day-to-day functions that is expected out of you to carry out your job effectively. When you talk of goals, it means that these are the things that you need to achieve in your job from time to time. For instance, for a salesperson, there will be something called as a revenue goal, that you have to have so many crores or so many lakhs of revenues. Your goal should be to have so many new clients added. Your goal should be to retain the existing client. Your role should be to collect all the receivables, 95% of the receivables on time. So those will be the goals. Roles will be, these are the jobs that you need to do. You need to visit so many new clients every day. You need to cover this area, such and such. You need to meet such and such a sort of a people. You have to have such a geographical coverage. So that is the role that you will have for a salesperson. The difference between offer letter and appointment letter. Offer letter is you make an offer for that particular job, saying that these are the terms and conditions. Appointment is you typically, once you're appointed, you get the appointment letter saying that this is that you've been appointed as so and so person. These are there will be some overlap between the offer letter and the appointment letter, which will say that you've been appointed on these terms, and these are the terms and conditions there. These are the rules and regulations, etc., etc. So that is the difference. Okay, I think Sachin has a very good question. In your view, is in-house promotion better or recruiting person from outside is better? There is no standard answer for that. It varies from company to company. It varies from position to position. It varies from sector to sector. So both have their own benefits and demerits. Now, some of the benefits. So there is no yes or no answer for that. Now, if you say in-house promotion is better, now the positives are you give a growth path for that particular individual to move ahead in the organization. Now, should you recruit a person from outside? The positive of that is he might bring a totally different dimension to the way that business can be conducted, and there is diversity of culture. Sometimes it is always good to have a mix of people whom you recruit laterally into that organization, but then the culture of that organization should be something that the new person is able to adapt. That is something many times you find that there is a difficulty in that because the outside person may not be able to adapt to that culture in the organization. He may not be accepted initially by the team of people who are already sitting there. And therefore, the HR as a function has a very important role to play, that he is able to adapt himself or herself into the new setup. How to handle last minute offer declines? Can we take some steps to reduce it? Now, this is a problem that is faced with from time to time. Again, here, if your initial communication to the candidates has been very clear, I think we talked about the job reviews and other things. I think if all those practices are put in place, then obviously, much of these last minute rejects will not be happening. But I think, as I mentioned there, I think 15 to 35% of the candidates are weeded out by the time this whole job review is done. So which means that only people who are actually interested are the ones who will move ahead in the interview process. The rest will not even come for the final rounds of interview. So that is one way of looking at this. I think the time period between onboarding the candidate and the final interview, that what is the time frame? Typically, see, I don't think you should provide an option of more than a month, because many of these, I think from the final interview, from the time that you make an offer, typically you should, in some cases, if the company is willing to take on the payment of the, let's say the notice period payment is taken care of by the company and the relieving company accepts it, then you can get them on board as quickly as possible. But let's say if there is a problem there, then you might have to give a 1 month's notice there. Tools available for retention. I think we have times for another 7 to 8 minutes. So I'll try and see if we can remove. Okay. I think the question. Okay, I think there are a few more questions which I can see on the screen now. For organizing interviews for one person, minimum how many persons to be called? Okay, that entirely depends on what is the position, what has been the past experience, and what is the sort of the ratio that we offer to decline, sort of ratio that one experiences. So that's something that will have to be tailor-made individually. I don't think there's a standard set of benchmarks made work for that. And how to use Facebook for recruitment. Obviously there, I think, what are you seeing on Facebook? I think one of the slides there I had put out also. There, I think that was a slide on this PepsiCo, for instance. Basically, it does details on everything about the company. I think it creates that sort of brand awareness there. It also opens up what the philosophies are, and then you'll also have the recruitment linked ads which can be given on Facebook. So that's something which is effectively done. I think today, even if you go and open on LinkedIn, you'll find that if you're part of that, hooked onto that particular companies as a LinkedIn sort of member, then you'll find that you get maybe on a daily basis, or the frequency that you want, the number of positions that are available or opened up for this thing. So that is something that you can use effectively. Okay, I think SC has a question. Does CII have a database of professionals who conduct tests for recruitment, online tests and offline tests? If yes, how is it accessible? I think SC, I think what you need to do is you can just drop in a mail to CII. I think the concerned person or department within CII should be able to answer that question of yours. Okay, I think there's one last question that we will take. I think we are reaching the scheduled close. I think Archana has a question in terms of what are RJPs. RJPs are realistic job previews. I think the name itself suggests basically for what does it suggest? What should employees expect in a particular job? So while employees or potential applicants have certain expectations of the job, RJPs, they are exposed to the real life situation on what a job entails. So their expectations become more and more realistic. So once they're through with that process, then they're able to even deselect themselves from this entire recruitment process. So the recruiter also is happy that he's only dealing with certain set of people whom he thinks are competent enough to or happy to be part of the company. So they can also make, the candidates can also make informed choices. So both negative and positive aspects of the job will also come to the fore when you go through this process. Like give you that example of that salesman, for instance. So basically, what are the conditions that he works in? Whom does he meet? What does he talk? Will I be able to do such a thing? You're only a silent partner when you go for these RJPs to basically to see what the person is doing. Will I be able to talk all this to the potential customers? What sort of late hours? It's actually a simulated, it is done before the recruitment. It is done before the recruitment, done before the final interview and job offer is made. Now, if it is done after the recruitment, you can do nothing because let's say the person doesn't like that particular job. In many cases, you have found that the person leaves immediately after a day without notice or anything. It has happened to a lot of people who have worked, I worked with, we have recruited somebody and then after a day, they would have found that maybe they didn't like the culture or maybe they didn't like interacting with the sort of people that they did. It can be any number of reasons for a person's leaving. So let's say that someone is taking up a job which requires, late hours. You thought that you can come at 9 and leave at 5 with, 2 long breaks. That was the perception of your job. When you came and you found that you had to work from morning 9 to night 10 under very stressful conditions, then you might go back home and say that I'm not interested in taking up this job. You may not attend the next stage of interview. So it is actually good, and I think it is important for more companies to get into this. Obviously, when you're recruiting in a big mass, you cannot go through this whole process, but selectively you can go through this for certain positions. If you're small, for instance, you'll be able to do this preview. Let's say an SME wants to recruit somebody. They go through this process. You have to meet hundreds of people before you get one order. There may not be people who are willing to do that. So why waste the time of both the recruiter and the candidate? So it's a very important tool that you do. So it's a good this thing, and you get a very true picture of what the company is all about. So good. I think I've answered all the questions which have popped up here. So I think the time exactly is just turned 1 o'clock on the screen. So thanks very much. I think it was a very good question answer session. I think a lot of interesting questions. So thanks very much for your time. So I think Ms. Archana has a few more questions. I think about Halo Effect. I think those will be clarified. Okay, I think I can just take that last thing since she's just asked in the last minute. Halo effect is basically an effect that you form, basically an opinion or impression that you have about a candidate based on the first few questions that you have. You might ask a question, tell me about your family, or tell me about what your career aspirations are. You cannot judge a person based on 1 or 2 questions. So that is what the Halo effect is. Good. So thanks so much for your time, and hopefully all of you benefited from this webinar and the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, I think the entire video recording will be there on this website, myca.in. Thank you.